India is facing international criticism and protests after spokespersons of the ruling BJP party made derogatory comments about the Prophet Muhammad. Gulf states and the wider Muslim world have condemned India, and some have demanded official apologies over the matter. India has distanced itself from the two spokespersons, calling them, quote, fringe elements, and the BJP has disciplined them. But that hasn't calmed the anger.
Muslim activists taking to the streets of India and in neighboring Pakistan, protesting what they see as the latest insults from India's ruling party against their religion. But this time the outrage is coming from foreign governments too. Qatar, Kuwait, Indonesia, and Malaysia have all summoned their Indian ambassadors to protest, and Saudi Arabia also lodged complaints. Anger, too, from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the IOC. It said these cases of defamation are part of a growing spate of hatred and defamation of Islam in India and systematic practices against Indian Muslims. The outcry is focused on Nupur Sharma, who, as a spokeswoman for Prime Minister Narendra Modi's BJP party, made remarks seen as insulting Islam's Prophet Muhammad and his wife. The BJP took no action until the sudden chorus of diplomatic anger. The party has now suspended Sharma's membership and expelled another spokesman. But one observer has told DW News that baiting Muslims is in the BJP's DNA.
It's partly vote bank politics and partly it's a part of their core ideology. And that's why since last 8 years, when Mr. Modi became the Prime Minister, this demonization of the Muslims, the demonization of the Islam and demonization of minorities have become such a big issue in this country.
The outcry has also taken on an economic dimension, with shop owners in some Muslim states boycotting Indian goods. But it's doubtful that could impress Hindu nationalists.
They might be little restrained, but the core will remain the same. I don't think the core will change. Physiology might change, the language might change, but the targeting of the Muslims will continue.
Still, the international outcry seems to have forced India's BJP onto a road it was not expecting to take.
And joining me now for more from Manama in Bahrain is Hassan Al-Hassan. He's a research fellow for Middle East policy at the think tank, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Mr. Al-Hassan, welcome. India's foreign ministry has said that these comments on the Prophet Muhammad were those of fringe elements and that the government respects all religions. I mean, is this explanation going to be enough for Gulf states in particular?
Thanks for having me on the show. I think it's fairly difficult to call these elements fringe elements. I mean, this was ultimately the BJP's national spokesperson, and there have been other high-ranking BJP officials who've had their membership suspended for similar comments. And I think the anti-Muslim rhetoric has become fairly normalized. It has become fairly mainstream in India today. So I think the MEA's, the Ministry of External Affairs, explanation that these are fringe elements, I don't think is very credible. But I do think that the Gulf states are very much interested in containing this issue. And so the Indian government has moved fairly swiftly in distancing itself from these comments. The BJP, the ruling party itself, has also attempted to distance itself from these comments. It has suspended Nupur Sharma, the spokesperson in question, and also other officials such as Naveen Jindal. I think it's for the Gulf states, I mean, they traditionally have always shied away from interfering in India's domestic politics, and have done their level best to do so, even when other Muslim states, such as Iran or Turkey, or even Malaysia under the former Prime Minister Mahathir bin Mohamad, criticized India for, say, revoking Article 370 and changing the status of Jammu and Kashmir. The Gulf states have held back traditionally because they've always sought to not to interfere. But insulting the Prophet, when the spokesperson of the ruling party insults the Prophet Muhammad on satellite TV, that's a different ballgame altogether. That ceases to be an internal matter.
I therefore have to ask you, because you said that it doesn't appear very credible, India's response so far. How then can Gulf states in particular, for example, move past this?
I think, so on the one hand, the fact that the Gulf states can't appear as doing nothing, because within days of Nupur Sharma making those comments on TV, these comments were picked up on, they circulated in social media, and they've generated a very hostile reaction among people in the Gulf. And it's not just on social media. I mean, I live here and I see the outrage that this has generated here among real people. And so the Gulf states couldn't really just stand by and be seen as doing nothing. They had to take a strong position on this. But I think that the Gulf states view India as an important partner, just as much as India views them as being key relations. And so I think they will try and contain this, work with the Indian government to make sure that such comments are not made again. It's interesting to see how the Indian government has tried to approach this. So on the one hand, they've appeared very conciliatory in their relations, in India's relations with the Gulf states. Right. But the Indian government at the same time has hit back against the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, very hard, and has criticized the OIC for condemning those remarks. And so I think by taking this sort of two-pronged approach, and this is a traditional Indian tactic of appeasing the Gulf states bilaterally, but hitting hard against the OIC. Right. By doing so, the Indian government is trying to repair its diplomatic relations with and contain those differences with key partners in the Gulf, while still catering to chauvinistic, nationalistic constituents back home by hitting hard against the OIC.
Right. I think some of the criticism in India has been that if these kind of anti-Islamic comments and if criticizing the Prophet Muhammad is a red line, then why isn't the detention of up to 1 million Muslims in Chinese camps in Xinjiang a red line? I mean, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the UAE are among the 45 countries that backed China at the UN in 2020 when it came to its stand in Xinjiang.
So, as a matter of fact, the Gulf states have also not interfered and have not made very virulent remarks about a lot of the communal hatred and violence that goes on in India. And they haven't taken, as I said, a very strong stand on India's revocation of Article 370 on Kashmir. The problem is that insulting the Prophet, and that's just because of the Gulf states' traditional policy of not interfering in the affairs of other nations, right? And so the Gulf states are not single-mindedly animated by Muslim causes around the world. They realize that they've got important relationships and partnerships with states like India and China, and therefore do their best not to interfere in what these states consider to be their internal matters. Right. But when it comes to insulting the Prophet Muhammad, that crosses that's a different thing altogether. And there have been previous instances where insults of the Prophet Muhammad in places like Denmark and France have also cast their shadow on diplomatic relations between Arab and Muslim states in these countries. And so India isn't being singled out in any respect. I think what the Indian government under Modi has done is really, it's been somewhat of a paradox, India's relations with the Arab Gulf states and the Muslim world. Whereas on the one hand, domestically, the BJP ruling party has pursued a fairly divisive communal agenda directed especially at the Muslims. Yeah. And on the other hand, Prime Minister Modi has probably directed more diplomatic energy towards India's relations with the Gulf states than any other prime minister in India's history. Right. And he's attempted to maintain this artificial separation between the domestic agenda and India's foreign relations in the Gulf. Right. But I think Nupur Sharma has almost entirely upended that strategy by insulting the Prophet and bringing international attention to the BJP's domestic political agenda.
Right. We'll have to leave it there for the time being, but thank you so much for joining us today. Hassan Al-Hassan from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.